for a moment while I get my notes out and find where I was. Daniel chapter 8 is where we are. Now, in my notes, I don't know what page it is, but I'll find it. Somewhere along in here. There we go. If you've been here, we've been talking about our subject is the time between the testaments. And we've been in the book of Daniel for a few weeks now. And we'll be for at least a couple more, depending on how fast I go. But Daniel is one of the great books of the Old Testament that has a lot of prophecies. Now, I want to one more time mention that prophecy is not necessarily predicting the future. There were many prophets in the Old Testament that didn't predict future, but they just spoke God's word. But part of the prophets and some of the prophets did indeed predict future events. Daniel is one of those. Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel had dreams of his own. And we've been looking at Daniel chapter 8 and the dream that's there that Daniel had. And we'd already started discussing this. Get over to the Bible. I wanted to read we'd gotten down to about verse 20. Now, let me back up a little. Daniel has had this dream. We talked about it. It was a dream of beast, different kinds of beast, bear, pardon me, bear and a leopard. I'll be okay in just a minute, and that throat wobble just kicks in. And as we were reading through the description of these beasts, remember that the lion, which was the first beast, had 2 wings. And I mentioned that this was Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. And then the next beast was a bear, and it represented the Medo-Persian Empire. And the next beast was a leopard, and it represented the Grecian Empire. It had 4 wings, and those wings our commentators interpreted those as being the speed at which they came to power. And the Medes and Persians were fast. The Greeks were extremely fast. Alexander the Great, doing all his conquering and all his expansion of the Grecian Empire in just a short 13 years. And then the next beast, in verse 7 says, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying, extremely strong, had large iron teeth that devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. This was the Roman Empire. Now, this is an interpretation. Up to this point in time, you have to rely on what you know about history or what others know about history. But I want to go down to, that's in chapter 7. Chapter 8, there was another dream, and it involved a ram and a goat. And the ram was the Medes and the Persians, and the goat, in verse 5 of chapter 8, while observing a male goat was coming up from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. And later on in the dream, the horn was shattered, and other horns arose from that. And this would represent the Grecian Empire. I say we talked about that last week, but let's go down to verse 15. Start reading there. it came about when I, Daniel, had seen the vision that I sought to understand it, and behold, standing there before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ui, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision. Gabriel is an angel. This is the first time in the Bible the name of an angel is mentioned. But Gabriel is told to give Daniel an understanding. Verse 17, so he came to me where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Son of man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. Now, when he was talking with me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and made me stand upright. And he said, Behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur in the final period of indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. Depending on which commentator you look at, and some have a dual, I say, interpretation. This refers to the time of the end of the Jews, and some believe it refers to the time of the end of the earth. It certainly has to pertain to the time of the end of the Jews, because the following verses we'll read just a few minutes. For all practical purposes, the Jews as a people and as a religion came to a total and final end in AD 70. They had ceased to be a nation independent on their own after the fall of Judah to the Babylonians. But they remained, even though they weren't ruling themselves, they remained a nation and a people for several hundred years after that. Through the period of time to the end of the Old Testament, which included the time of the Babylonians and the Medes and the Persians, to the time in between the Testaments where the Greeks would come to power and where the Romans would come to power, and into the first century when the Romans were in power. And in the first century, of course, Christ came, and Christ set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed, according to the prophecies that Daniel had mentioned, himself had mentioned, Daniel 2:44. But the Jews as a whole rejected that because they were looking for something else. They were looking for an earthly kingdom. And Jesus did not fulfill what they were expecting, so they rejected him. Well, that was in the first part of the first century. Jesus was on the earth for about 33 years. After he ascended, shortly after he ascended, the church began on the day of Pentecost there in the first century, and about probably AD 33. And the church began to grow and spread. But the Jews were still around, and in many times in the New Testament, we read about, for instance, the Apostle Paul having problems with the Jews. They persecuted the church. They were against the church. It represented the end of their nationality in one sense. They were no longer the Jews, the people of God, because now there was a new Israel. And the Jews, they had rebelled many times in the past, if you're standing in the first century, against various powers that ruled over them, but the Romans in particular. And they would have one more rebellion against the Romans, and the Romans decided to end it all and sent an army down to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was destroyed and sacked, and temple was destroyed. Jesus himself had said that there would not be a stone unturned from the temple. And I've mentioned before, it was the practice of Roman armies that when they conquered a land, the general who was in charge of the army was allowed to pay his soldiers in whatever way he wanted. And normally the tradition was they got to take all the war booty they could take. And when Jerusalem was destroyed, now recall this was not the first temple, but it was a magnificent building with lots and lots of gold, gold on the walls. And I can see those Roman soldiers not leaving one stone unturned to get to that gold, melt it off those walls, and take it for their war booty. And they destroyed all the Jewish records. In the Old Testament, the tribe you belonged to was important. The priests all came from the tribe of Levi, and they could trace their genealogy all the way back to Levi, the son of Jacob. Or they could trace their genealogy back all the way to Judah or Benjamin. They knew that. They kept track of it. It was important to them. Well, all those official records were destroyed by the Romans. Today, no Jew can trace his genealogy back to Levi. There could be no legitimate Jewish priest today, according to the law of Moses, because no one knows who the Levites were. It's impossible. Those records have been gone for 2,000 years now. So the Jews, as a ruling nation, came to an end in the Old Testament when Babylon took Jerusalem. But the Jews came to an end as a nation, if you will, where they kept all the genealogies in AD 70. Now they would continue, Jews still exist today, but no one, not a one, can trace their genealogy. And therefore, they can't have priests according to the law of Moses, which is what they propose to keep following. Well, yes.
It's important to note there that, we don't always understand God's providence and the way He uses His creation for His own glory
Right.
and His own plan. But when you look at that, the records were destroyed like that. That completely eliminates the possibility of anybody in the Jewish nation to try to rise up and say they're a priest, a high priest. What we have one high priest now.
Yes.
Jesus.
Well, let's say the New Testament tells us there's a new Israel,
Yes.
the church, and that Christians are what? A holy priesthood.
We're the holy priesthood. Jesus.
But we have a high priest, yeah. We still have a high priest, but it's no longer someone from the tribe of Levi.
Exactly.
And no man today can prove he's of the tribe of Levi. They cannot legitimately have a high priest. And every Christian is called a priest. And stepping aside, the function of the priest in the Old Testament was to speak to God for the people and have sacrifices for the people. The people would bring the sacrifice to the priest. They would participate in the sacrifice. The priest kept some of the, if it was edible, kept some of that for their food. But the priests were involved as the go-between between God and the people. Well, that ended when Christ came. And now Christians are their own priest. There's some significance too at the crucifixion when the veil was torn between the holy place and the most holy place. There was no longer a separation, and all Christians are priests. All Christians today can speak to God through Jesus. We can all pray. Yes.
We're also called a royal priesthood.
Right.
We have a king.
Well, that's that. We have a king. We have a high priest and a king, and they're the same persons, Jesus. Well, that's going past the time between the testaments, but just barely. But all those things that happened in the first century, many of them were set up by the things that happened at the end of the Old Testament time period and at 400 years between the testaments. And part of that was the Jews and their attitudes. And down the road, in a few more weeks, we're going to talk about some things that happened in the time between the testaments, or mentioned in the Bible, about how the Jews reacted to various things. But here back in Daniel now, Daniel's had this vision, and now Gabriel has been told to tell him what it means. And this is rare, if not unique. The names of the nations, some of the nations are actually mentioned. Let's look at Daniel chapter 8. Go back to verse 19 again. And he said, behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time at the end. And I believe that points to the time at the end and approaching the end of the Jews. Verse 20, the ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. That ram had two horns. One was smaller than the other. One horn represented Persia. One horn represented Media. The Medians came first, but they weren't as prominent as the Persians. Nonetheless, they were one empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. And here in verse 20, they are identified explicitly as Media and Persia. Let's look at verse 21. And the shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. I believe I told you last week, Alexander the Great came from Macedonia, called the land of goats. The Aegean Sea, Aegea, means goat in Greek. Alexander was this large goat, this goat that came from the kingdom of Greece, and he was the large horn between the eyes. He was the first king that united the Grecian Empire. His name isn't mentioned, but his nation is Greece. So the shaggy goat is Greece. No, verse 22, and the broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent four kingdoms which arise from his nation, although not with his power. I'll mention again, Alexander conquered from the Mediterranean world all the way to India, down into Africa, far up north into Europe and the Middle East. But when he was 33 years old, he died. There's a lot of speculation as to how he died. We know he died in Babylon. He had no heir to the throne. So his empire was split four ways between four of his generals. And this is referred to here being in verse 22. Now, again, Daniel lived from about 610 BC to 520 BC. The Greeks didn't come to power for 200 or 300 more years. So Daniel, here in his prophecy, this is predicted 250 years or so before it actually occurred. And he names the country Greece. When Daniel wasn't alive, Greece was a bunch of city-states that fought amongst each other. But 250 years later, such would not be the case. Let me go on and read the rest to the end of the chapter here. Verse 23, and the latter period of their rule, these four kings of four nations, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will rise insolent and skilled in intrigue, and his power will be mighty, but not his own power. But he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, and through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. He will magnify himself in his heart. He will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes. He will be broken without human agency. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which has been told is true. But keep the vision correct, for it pertains to many days in the future. So Daniel's told this vision pertains to a long time from now, many days in the future. And indeed it was many days. And again, there's some that believe that part of this refers to the end of time, but I think it refers to the end of the nation of the Israelites, because it applies very, very strongly to them. And these nations, let's say Media and Persia and Greece, are mentioned explicitly. Let me mention once again real quick, the kings that took over after Alexander died. Cassandra controlled Macedonia and Greece. A man named Lysimachus controlled Thrace and Asia Minor. And they don't have a lot to do with the Jews. There are Jews in their area, but they don't have a lot to do with the Jews. However, a man named Ptolemy took control of Egypt. And Ptolemy would have a lot of influence over the Jews. And another man named Seleucus controlled Syria and Babylonia. He also would have a lot of influence over the Jews in the time between the Testaments. None of these ever attained or came close to the power of Alexander, but they took over the Grecian Empire. When Alexander the Great was living, and I'm going to jump ahead to the time between the Testaments, we'll talk about this in more detail later, but when Alexander was conquering, he came to a point where he had taken Tyre and Sidon, and we'll talk about that in more detail later, but he got to Jerusalem. Now, many times when Alexander conquered a country or conquered a city, he destroyed it and executed their kings in various and sundry ways, sometimes very cruelly. But when he got to Jerusalem, something different happened. I have a long excerpt out of a book called The Antiquities of the Jews, written by a man named Flavius Josephus, considered to be the greatest Jewish historian of that time. And Josephus writes that when Alexander was coming to Jerusalem, the Jews, the high priest and the priest, were greatly afraid of Alexander because of what he had been doing. And they were afraid that they were going to be wiped out and destroyed, and their city destroyed, the temple destroyed. So they decided to go out and meet him. And they went out dressed in their best to impress Alexander, and he came out to meet them. And one of the things they took with them to show Alexander was the book of Daniel. And they let him see part of it. They let him see the part that said a goat from Greece would destroy the Medes and the Persians. Alexander was extremely impressed, apparently, because he did not sack Jerusalem. He did not destroy it. He actually went into Jerusalem, worshiped in the temple, made sacrifices in the temple, and when he asked the priest, "What do you want?" And they told him they wanted to be, left to survive, and their religion left to survive, and their way of life left to survive. And Alexander granted that to them. Apparently, and a lot of historians agree on this, because of what he read in the book of Daniel. And when he saw it, he knew it was talking about him because it fit so well. And indeed, commentators, they all agree that Alexander's the one that's being talked about in the book of Daniel. So the Jews in that time between the Testaments, when Alexander got to them, they avoided destruction. They avoided the end of their way of life. They avoided the end of their religion, all because Daniel had prophesied about a Greek king who would destroy Media and Persia. And when Alexander saw that, it impressed him very much. He went on down the way. I'm jumping ahead a bit. He would go on down to Gaza. When he got to Gaza, he wasn't so forgiving. They resisted him, and they paid a price, and their king paid a price. We'll get to that much later, but it's very interesting that secular history records by the writings of Josephus what Alexander did when he got to Jerusalem. He recognized himself in the prophecy. And he was a very young man. I mean, he's only 33 when he died, and he's in his 20s when he gets to Jerusalem, because he's still going to conquer the rest of the Mideast and Egypt and then go out to India. So he's still got a lot of conquering to do. But nonetheless, this was such a important prophecy that he was shown it. And this is what the priest wanted to do. They wanted to impress him to save their skins, if you will, and it actually worked. So, again, the Old Testament prophecy, this prediction is one of the great ones in that and I think it's great in that it actually names, a country explicitly. It names Media and Persia, names Greece. Now it gets on down, and the rest of that, it talks about another power will come, and here you're getting some differences of opinion, but where I'm at in verse 23, in the latter period of their rule, that's these 4 Greek generals, when transgressors have run their course, a king will arise insolent and skilled in intrigue. If you look at the secular history of these 4 kings, it is extremely confusing. They made alliances with each other, and then they'd break them immediately. There's one instance of 2 of them getting together and having a dinner together and agreeing they will do certain things to help each other. And both of them, when they left the dinner, the next day, went totally against the agreement. They had just made that agreement to fool the other king, and they fooled each other. There was marriages of convenience between the 2 of the kingdoms or 3 of the kingdoms, and then those marriages would fail. There was one where one king gave his daughter as a wife, and then with the purpose of her turning against her husband, turned out she fell in love with her husband, loved her husband more than her father, so it didn't work out for the father. Lots of alliances, as they were broken. It's a time of confusion, a time when one king transgressed against the other, time and again. And it led, of course, to the easy downfall of what the Greek Empire was then, to the Romans, who were coming up in power at that point in time. But there's some that believe this king that rose up during this time was a man named Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes means Antiochus the Great, or the Illustrious. The Jews would call him Antiochus Epimanes, Antiochus the Mad. He was an evil man beyond description. He hated the Jews beyond description. We'll talk in more detail about some of this later, but some of the things he did, he desecrated the temple by putting up idols to Greek gods in it. He had sacrifices to these gods in the temple in Jerusalem, and his sacrifices were pigs. What were the pigs to the Jews? Unclean animals. They had nothing to do with them. He desecrated the temple in every way he could. And he literally had thousands of Jews executed on more than one occasion. He was a terrible, terrible man. He was one of the subsequent rulers after those 4 kings. And a whole lineage of kings, I can't pronounce the word right, Seleucidad came from Seleucus, the general of Alexander that took over that part of Alexander's reign. Again, that isn't mentioned explicitly in Daniel, but these things happened in that period of time between the Testaments, all as a result of the Grecian Empire falling and being split up. It would never again rise to power. Yes.
I think it's real interesting, after he died, what his requests were, that the best doctors at that time would carry his coffin to the grave, and the significance of that was to show that
No.
And then, the second one was that his treasures that he had acquired would be scattered along the way, showing that you can't take it with you, it remains on the earth. And then the third one was that his hands be laid open out of the coffin, showing, that, we came into the world empty-handed and we leave empty-handed.
I was unaware of that. I didn't read that. I've studied some of Alexander's military history and what he did and how he conquered. And say there's speculation how he died. Some believe he had a fever. Some believe he ate something and it poisoned him. And there's different ideas. He was a great leader, a great military leader, and a great man in many ways. He instituted things, and the bell's rang, I can go ahead, I'll say, he instituted things that were still in effect in the first century. He carried on some traditions of the Medes and the Persians, which the Romans picked up and were still in effect in the first century. He made Greek the common language, and that had to have that was an important role in the New Testament, because the New Testament was written in that Greek language that Alexander made the common language of his whole empire. And even when the Romans came, now the Romans spoke Latin, but their everyday common language was still Greek. Everybody knew Greek. It was kind of like English today, you know. When I was working, I worked with a fellow that grew up in Vietnam, and I knew that Vietnam had been a French colony. So I asked him, well, do you speak French? He said, oh, no. He said, why learn French? Where do they speak French? France. He said, in Vietnam, we were taught English, because he said in English, anywhere in the world you go, you can speak English and find someone that understands you. Well, that's the way it was in the first century with Greek. Anywhere in the world you would go, if you knew Greek, you could communicate. And that's what the New Testament was written in. So anywhere in the world, those letters that were written by the apostles, by Paul, anywhere they went, they were understandable because they could be read. And that's all because of one of the things Alexander did. He allowed the countries that he conquered, for the most part, to keep their own traditions and religions. He had inherited that thought from Cyrus, the Persian king. And when the Romans came along, they followed that to a large degree too. So the Jews were allowed to keep their religion as long as they didn't cause too many problems. But with the Romans, they would cause more and more problems. So the Jewish religion was still intact in the first century. It had been changed. We're going to talk about some of that. Sects had arisen. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. They had come up with what were known as the oral traditions. And we'll talk more about them. And they came to regard them as being more important than the law of Moses. We see that today sometimes when people make changes to a denomination, and those changes are more important than what the Bible says. It's still happening. Well, it happened in the 400 years between the Testaments, and those things were in effect when Jesus came to the earth, and he had to deal with them, and the apostles did, and the early church did. All right, well, the bells rang. Next week, we will be over in Daniel. We'll talk about Daniel chapter 9 just a little bit, and then we'll get over into chapters 10 and 11. And in chapter 11, there's another, chapter 10, there's a vision, and in 11, there's more things that are mentioned, but will take effect in that time between the Testaments and at the end of the Old Testament. So if you want to read chapters 10 and 11 of Daniel, we'll be discussing those next week. You're dismissed.